Good afternoon, everyone. I am Daniel Diermeier. I'm the Provost of the University of Chicago, and it is my distinctive pleasure to welcome you to the second annual Reverend Dr. Richard L. Pearson Lecture. This event provides an opportunity to bring leading peacemakers to the campus here at the University of Chicago to share their experience in working to resolve some of the most challenging global conflicts. The Pearson Institute was founded in 2015, and since then has grown into a flourishing institute. Led by world-renowned scholar James Robinson, the Institute has hosted dozens of speakers, funded faculty and graduate student research projects in conflict around the world, offered classes in global conflict at the undergraduate and graduate student level, and provided critical support for master's and PhD students at the Harris School of Public Policy, also known as the Pearson Fellows and Pearson Scholars. Most importantly, Pearson faculty and Pearson faculty affiliates have active research projects underway in a whole variety of places around the world, including Afghanistan, Nigeria, and Colombia, where their rigorous analytical research is targeted to have direct impact on violent conflicts. We could not be prouder of the work being done by the faculty, staff, and students affiliated with the Pearson Institute and the university. Today, we are honored to host Jonathan Powell, director and founder of the non-profit Intermediate. Mr. Powell served as chief of staff to British Prime Minister Tony Blair and was one of the chief negotiators from the British government in the peace talks in Northern Ireland. This conflict, also known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland, spanned 3 decades and resulted in the death of more than 3,700 people, many of them civilians, and left more than 40,000 people injured and maimed. The violence between Protestant loyalists, those wanting to remain part of the United Kingdom, and Catholic nationalists, those wanting a united Ireland, has left an indelible mark on the island and its history. Many considered this conflict one of those conflicts that could never be resolved, and indeed, there were many failed attempts at peace negotiations. However, as many of you know, just last week in Belfast, a city that was dramatically impacted by violence and where there are still 30-foot high peace walls separating Catholic and Protestant neighborhoods, people came together to celebrate the 20th anniversary of a historic peace accord. This Good Friday Agreement, signed on April 10th, 1998, has resulted in a lasting peace in Northern Ireland, and while challenges still remain, the peace has held. Representatives from the British government, the Irish government, and 8 Northern Ireland political parties participated in the talks that ultimately culminated in the agreement. It was a difficult, challenging, and long process that required trust, bravery, and creativity from everyone involved. Senator George Mitchell, the US Special Envoy to Northern Ireland, who served as the independent chairman for the talks, has described the process as 700 days of failure in 1 day of success. Today, we have the special opportunity to hear from Mr. Powell, who was deeply involved in these historic talks, and who has gone on to share his experience with people around the world who are attempting to build peace and end active violent conflicts. We look forward to hearing from Mr. Powell, but before we turn to our speaker today, I'd like to invite Sarah Boyle to offer a few remarks. Sarah is a second-year MPP student at Harris and a Pearson Fellow. Sarah, please join us on the stage.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Daniel. My name is Sarah Boyle, and I'm a second-year MPP at the Harris School of Public Policy. I'm also a recipient of the Pearson Fellowship, a scholarship opportunity for Harris students to engage in the study of global conflict. As an undergraduate at the University of St. Andrews in the United Kingdom, I studied international relations with a focus on conflict development. I was fortunate to be taught by some of the top scholars in the field who were personally familiar with the Troubles. As a bright-eyed 18-year-old ready to study, this was one of the first conflicts that I became familiar with. As I think back to my first years of university in the UK and studying the Troubles, the inspiring moment to come out of this was that they ended in successful peace accords. We are fortunate today to hear from we have the fortunate opportunity to hear from Jonathan Powell today, one of the key individuals responsible for bringing about this historic accord. When I was choosing a graduate school, I sought a university where I could once again study the many different elements of conflict. Here at Harris, and as a Pearson Fellow, I've been able to research conflicts with a new approach, quantitatively and with data. This new approach has not made the topic any less complex. However, it has provided a new perspective for the study and resolution of conflicts. In my 2 years as a Pearson Fellow and a Harris student, I have had the opportunity to meet with several individuals from across sectors working in international policy and conflict resolution. Here at Harris, Professor Blattman taught me the theory of why government and institutions develop in order to curb violence. Professor Wright taught me the many challenges of undertaking conflict when using open source data. And Professor Robinson taught me the importance and impact that institutions have on conflicts and peace processes. Today, I'd like to introduce Professor James Robinson. James is the Institute Director of the Pearson Institute. He is the Reverend Dr. Richard L. Pearson Professor for Global Conflict Studies and a University Professor at Harris Public Policy. Professor Robinson conducts research on the political economy of development and the factors that are the root causes of conflict. His work explores how institutions emerge out of conflict and the relationship between inequality, conflict, and democracy. He is widely recognized as the co-author of Why Nations Fail, The Origins of Power, Prosperity, and Poverty, translated into 32 languages since its publication in 2012. It is my honor today to welcome Professor James Robinson to the stage.
700 days of failure and 1 day of success. It sounds like academic research, doesn't it? It's like the story of my life. Anyway, I'll be very brief. So I'm James Robinson, the Institute Director. We're just super excited and happy and honored to have Jonathan Powell here. I tend to think about my research, it's about, like many social scientists, we're sort of describing something. We're describing an equilibrium. We're describing a constellation of forces that creates poverty or creates violence or creates inequality or underdevelopment. But the idea of this lecture when we conceived it was not to have somebody else, describing poverty or inequality or underdevelopment, not describing an equilibrium. We wanted to invite people who get up out of bed every morning and try to think about how do you construct a different equilibrium? How do you move people to think in different ways, to bury their conflicts, to conceive of the world differently, their relationships to other people differently? And I can't think of anyone with a better track record of constructing different equilibria in society, not just in Northern Ireland, but in many parts of the world than Jonathan Powell. So we're just delighted to have him here. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much. I'm pleased and honored to be asked to give the second Reverend Richard L. Pearson annual lecture, following on from my friend and colleague, Sergio Hamarillo, who gave it last year, a wonderful guy and someone I've worked with for 7 years. And let me thank the University of Chicago, the Harris School, and Professor James Robinson for making it possible. Most of all, I'm thrilled to be asked to talk about something I'm absolutely passionate about. As James said, I'm a practitioner, not a theoretician. I was a British diplomat for 16 years. I had no training in negotiation, but spent most of that time working on negotiations. I became Tony Blair's chief of staff, and by accident, I became the chief negotiator for a decade on Northern Ireland. On leaving government, I worked on the ETA conflict in Spain, which happily ended with an agreement in 2011. Unhappily, I worked in Libya as Special Envoy for David Cameron, which didn't end and still hasn't ended, sadly. We now, my little charity, Intermediate, we work on 11 conflicts around the world, and I've decided that I will devote the rest of my life to trying to work on this kind of thing, to try and see if we can end conflicts. Often we fail, but when you succeed, it is the most wonderful thing of all. I've written a couple of books on the subject, one on the Northern Irish negotiations, Great Hatred, Little Room, and one on these negotiations with terrorist groups more widely, called Talking to Terrorism. I have to say I wasn't always in favor of talking to terrorists. The first time I knowingly met two terrorists, I refused to shake their hands when we met Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness in 1997 in a little room we'd specially chosen with no windows so no one could film through the windows when they came in. The IRA had shot my father through the ear in an ambush in 1940. They'd put my brother, who worked for Mrs. Thatcher, on a death list for 8 years. I had spent a year at the embassy in Washington trying to stop Gerry Adams getting a visa to come to the United States, unsuccessfully. I didn't feel warm and cuddly about these people. About a couple of weeks later, I got a call from Martin McGuinness out of the blue. And he said, would I come and visit Northern Ireland incognito and not tell the police and not tell the army? So I asked my boss, Tony Blair, and he said, yes, go. So I took a plane to Belfast International, a taxi to Derry, and I stood on a street corner feeling faintly foolish, like someone out of a Le Carré novel. And two guys with shaved heads turned up and pushed me into the back of a cab saying, Martin sent us. They drove me around for an hour till I was completely lost in Derry, and then they pushed me out of the car outside a little modern house on the edge of an estate. And I knocked on the door, and Martin McGuinness came to the door on crutches. And Martin McGuinness is one of the best-known leaders of the IRA. And he made a very unfunny joke about kneecapping, which used to be the IRA's way of punishing people by drilling holes in their knees, their ankles, and their elbows. We spent 3 hours sitting in that house. The lady of the house had gone away and left us some sandwiches and some tea. We made no breakthroughs, but it came home to me that if we were going to make peace, we had to be prepared to talk to people like this, our enemies. We had to be prepared to go onto their turf, not to demand they come to Castles or to Downing Street. And we had to be prepared to try and build trust with them. It's only if you could build that trust, only if you listened to them, you were likely to have any prospect of success. Now, of course, there's a limit to how much trust you can build in those circumstances. I do remember later on, 2004, I think it was, negotiating with Adams and McGuinness in a monastery in West Belfast. And actually, I had this very watch on. We negotiated late, and I was quite scared I was going to miss my flight. The monks had given us dinner in the refectory, and I kept looking at my watch, and the minute hand had come loose and was swinging around hopelessly. McGuinness noticed too, and he said to me, oh, Jonathan, give me your watch. I've got a very good watchmaker at the end of my street. I'll get it fixed for you. And I said, no, honestly, Martin, really, you don't need to worry. No problem at all. He insisted on taking my watch away, and he gave it back to me 2 weeks later when we met at Leeds Castle for negotiations. It was nicely fixed. And I, of course, had to give it to the security authorities to have it checked for trackers and for bugs. So they took it to pieces and broke the minute hand again, and I had to have it fixed at great expense. So I wouldn't exaggerate the trust you can build, but you do need to do it if you can. Last week in Belfast, we had the 20th anniversary celebrations for the Good Friday Agreement. We had Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, Bertie Ahern, George Mitchell, and others. And I actually must say I found it a moving ceremony. I hadn't expected to, but it was really. I chaired a panel of the remaining political leaders, party leaders, those who haven't died, from the original negotiations, Gerry Adams and David Trimble, Peter Robinson, and so on. And I asked all of them why it was that we succeeded in 1998. Why did the Good Friday Agreement succeed when previous negotiations had failed? And I think this is a key thing I'd like to talk about today, because I think we can see many of the same lessons, many of the same reasons for success in Colombia that Sergio talked to you about last year, with ETA in Spain, in the Philippines, in El Salvador, and elsewhere. And I want to try and touch on some of those lessons in the 30 minutes for which I can speak. So the first I want to touch on is the importance of inclusivity. The reason that previous efforts in Northern Ireland had not succeeded was we never actually invited Sinn Féin, the most radical party. They were never included in the talks, and if they weren't included, they were unlikely to stop fighting. But it's very difficult for democratic governments to be seen to be talking to terrorists who are killing your people. How do you justify such talks? How do you make sure such talks don't collapse as soon as they carry out another outrage? And it's a very difficult political and moral challenge of whether you should talk to people when you have either violence or the threat of violence hanging over your head. And as a result, governments have always said, we will never talk to terrorists. If you look back right to 1919, Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister, the first iteration of the IRA in Ireland, he said, we will never talk to this murder gang. 2 years later, he sent out someone in more or less my position in Downing Street to try and find Michael Collins, the leader of the IRA, to start negotiations that led eventually to the treaty in 1922. So we always say we won't talk to terrorists, and yet we nearly always do. And we nearly always do it by opening up secret channels. Now, in 1972, the British government opened a secret channel to the IRA through a very brave secret intelligence agent called Michael Oatley. This channel operated from 72 onwards to 93. It serves a number of purposes along the way, but crucially, it allowed a correspondence between John Major, who was the Prime Minister before Tony Blair, and Martin McGuinness as leader of the IRA. Now, John Major completely denied this. He stood up in Parliament and he said he would never talk to Gerry Adams. To do so would turn his stomach. On exactly that same day, he was writing a letter to Martin McGuinness, and thank goodness he was doing so. If he hadn't been doing so, he would not have got to peace. You have to offer these armed groups some prospect of success in political talks before they'll engage. And as a democratic government, it's incredibly hard to engage if they're carrying out violent acts. In fact, very shortly after that exchange in the House of Commons, the IRA blew up 2 bombs in Warrington that killed 2 small children. And I've talked to the father of one of them, Colin Parry, whose son Tim, who was 12, was blown up. And he said to me that if anyone had told him when Tim lay dying in his arms, the British government was talking to the IRA, he would have been horrified. If anyone had told him 6 months later the British government was talking to the IRA, he'd have been delighted. He'd have known that his son did not die in vain, that there was going to be peace, there was a chance of making success. So even the victims, in many circumstances, understand why this has to happen. But it nearly always has to happen in a deniable way. It's not just in Britain. If you look at Spain with ETA, every prime minister since Suarez, immediately after Franco died, Suarez was the first prime minister, stood up in the Cortes in their parliament, and he said he would never talk to ETA. The leader of the opposition stood up, Felipe González, and said, but you told me over dinner last night you were talking to ETA. And Suarez said, no, I would never talk to ETA, and just denied it blankly. In Colombia, we had a similar, almost identical actually, almost identical in every way, secret channel to the FARC to start the negotiations while they were still in the jungle and to enable those negotiations to take place. So there is this problem where you need this channel if you are going to start. That trust building, that channel, takes much longer than people often think. It can't be done quickly. There's a huge burden of history that these conflicts carry. I used to joke in Northern Ireland, if we ended a meeting with any political party after just 30 minutes, we'd have got to 1689 and there'd be 300 more years of grievance to get through before we could actually get to today and the substance. That burden of history is enormously heavy. Many of these armed groups have lived in ghettos, either physical ghettos or at least intellectual ghettos, only talking to each other and very rarely getting to understand how they're seen elsewhere, and very rarely governments hearing from them how they see governments. The first meeting we had in Downing Street with Adams and McGuinness was in December 1997. It was a very big occasion. There were more TV cameras outside the front door than there had been for the election of Tony Blair in May of that year. And everyone was a little bit nervous. And Adams and McGuinness came into Downing Street. They came down the long corridor that takes you to the cabinet room at the end of the building. And I brought them into the building and took them round to the far side of the table with the windows behind them. And in an attempt to break the ice, Martin McGuinness, he put his hands on the back of the chair and he said, so this was where the damage was done then? And I was horrified. I said, yes, the IRA mortars landed in the garden behind you. The windows blew in. My brother, who was with John Major at the time, dragged him under the table to get him out of the falling glass. And he looked horrified and said, no, no, no. I was talking about the treaty with Michael Collins in 1922. There's a completely different sense of history on the two sides you had to break through if you had any chance of getting an understanding at the moment. And one of the problems is the need to actually listen to these people you're talking to, people who've never been shown any respect and never really had their arguments heard. Indeed, in Britain, they were banned from using their own voices or appearing on television until after the Troubles were over. And it can take a very long time. Eric Solheim, who worked on the negotiations in Sri Lanka with the Tamil Tigers, says it took him thousands of hours of very unpleasant meals in South London with warm Chardonnay, with Balasingham, the political leader of the Tigers, listening to him, listening to the same story again and again before he built enough trust to actually get the talks started. It's an opportunity, as you will know from studying negotiations, to actually understand what people's interests are rather than what their positions are. If you take the IRA, their position was the Brits should leave Northern Ireland. Their position was there should be a united Ireland. We never even discussed that in the negotiations. It was never even discussed at the table. We talked about other things, what their real interests were, power sharing to get away from the unionist domination, north-south bodies, the Irish language. And that process of a channel of building trust, is perhaps the single most important thing in any of these negotiations rather than trying to fly straight into them. Unless you have that proper preparation, you are unlikely to succeed. The third lesson, I think, is that it's not always the right time to move from a channel to a full negotiation. Now, there is an academic theory, as you will know, of ripeness. I think that's nonsense, personally, because how can you possibly know if a negotiation is ripe or not? You can't reach up and touch it like a pear on a tree or something and see if it's ripe to pick. You only know it's ripe afterwards. It's purely tautological. You know it's ripe because you succeeded.